Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Julia Orduña and I work with Texas Housers.
And my name is Jordan Pacelli Everett, and I work for the Center for Civic and Public Policy Improvement.
And we're happy to be here with you all for this live conversation. Today, we'll be talking about housing insecurity and how that has resulted from the pandemic in the form of evictions and the policy solutions that we want to enact to be able to reduce the impact of this housing crisis on low-income communities.
And we know that housing instability, the ability to afford rent, and homelessness were all huge issues pre-pandemic, pre-COVID. And today we want to look at beyond the pandemic and some of the policy implications, as well as through eviction courts, to see how we can advocate for better solutions that will stay after the pandemic. We know that since March 2020, there have been over 65,000 eviction filings in Harris County alone. So this is a huge issue that is impacting and harming our community here.
Yeah, so just to give you all a little more context, last week alone, there were 2,193 eviction filings only in 1 week. And just today, we know there are several dockets with over 100 hearings in a single docket. So we see these issues continue to persist, and we'd like to join you all to dive deeper into that conversation to understand what's happening in the courtrooms through evictions and how we can find solutions to really make this change for the future. We do welcome you to react with your thumbs and your hearts. If there's anything in the comments and the commentary that the panelists are saying that you agree with and you really like, we also welcome your questions in the comments. And if we can, we will definitely try and get to them. So today we have two panels joining us. For our first panel, we have Tori Tavormina. She is working to improve eviction policy through our local research, analysis, and advocacy. And at Texas Housers, she works with volunteers to monitor and collect data on Harris County evictions and court proceedings. We're also joined by Stormy S. Clark, a licensed attorney in the state of Texas. She is an exceptional advocate for her clients and dedicated to fighting for the underrepresented, underserved, and forgotten communities. Stormy earned her doctorate of jurisprudence from South Texas Southern University, Thurgood Marshall School of Law, where she graduated summa cum laude and in the top 10% of her class. During law school, Stormy interned at the Honorable Kenneth M. Hoyt as a judicial intern and in the United States Attorney's Office as a law clerk. Prior to joining the Earl Carl Institute, Stormy was awarded the award for the Association of Women's Attorneys Foundation's Pro Bono Fellowship with Tarisha Justice Center, where she provided client-centered and trauma-informed representation to immigrant survivors and gender-based violence. Stormy continues at the Earl Carl Institute family as a staff attorney for the Opal Mitchell Property Preservation Project with a diverse background. She is passionate in her work and committed to helping her clients resolve their legal issues.
Thank you. Yes, we're very excited for our first panel. And then for our second panel, we have David Wheaton, who is the Advocacy Director at Texas Housers in the Austin office. In this role, David supports grassroots leaders across Texas and develops and advances policies and practices that promote the purpose of the Fair Housing Act. And before joining Texas Housers, David was staff attorney at the Capital Appeals Project, the Promise of Justice Initiative, where he helped handle appeals for incarcerated people on death row in Louisiana. He's originally from Atlanta, and David has a BA in economics from Guilford College and a law degree from Elon University School of Law. And outside of work, he enjoys playing the saxophone and watching basketball. And then we have, for our second panel, joining David is Jay Malone, who is the Political and Communications Director for the Texas Gulf Coast Area Labor Federation. After conducting a member survey in March 2022, which found housing insecurity was a top concern. The 92 unions of the Area Labor Federation have led advocacy initiatives to keep working people in their homes, helping over 7,000 residents at risk of eviction connect with legal aid and rental assistance over the past 18 months as league organizers of the Keep Harris Housed Coalition.
Thank you all for joining us today. And so we will be getting right to it with our first panel. So we will see David and Jay later on today. So hello, Tori and Stormy. How y'all are doing today? How has it been so far?
Good. Happy to be here. I know Stormy had a busy morning, sounds like.
Yeah. Good morning or good afternoon now. Happy to be here. Thank you for having me. It's been quite the morning. I was in one of those large eviction dockets that you were speaking of. So I'll share a little bit more about that experience later throughout our panel.
Yeah, definitely. So I do want to ask you all a lot of these questions and just invite the dialogue in. So the first question I'm gonna throw to you, Stormy, first. Can you tell us what is eviction court? Who's in charge? What are the common practices in Texas for any of our friends that don't really know what evictions are right now?
Okay, so with eviction court, we actually have 8 precincts in Harris County, and they each have 2 different locations within that precinct. So there's a total of 16 potential eviction courts. And what happens at these eviction trials is the landlord may file a lawsuit to remove the tenant from possession of the property for various reasons, lease violations that could be non-payment of rent, criminal activity, health and safety, but it all boils down to the landlord wanting to remove the tenant from their home.
Yeah, and Tori, can you tell us about who's in charge in these spaces and what some of these practices are, or how eviction court should happen in Texas?
Yeah, so who's in charge mostly would be the justice of the peace, which is the judge who hears the case. And that is an elected official. Yeah, I believe they serve for 2 years. Yeah, okay, great. And yeah, things tend to happen really fast. So I've been sitting and observing court for about a year now and seen many cases, and most of our justices of the peace can just get through a lot of cases in a short amount of time, which can be stressful. And I mean, I don't think that should be how it is, right? It would be much better for the tenant if they had more time to speak and be heard. So that's one of the practices that's kind of not in the tenant's favor, I would say.
Yeah, I do hear that. And, we have heard a lot about the law skewing in favor of the landlord and tenants kind of getting the short end of the stick in eviction. So, Stormy, could you talk a little bit about some of those practices and policies that maybe don't favor the tenant as much?
Oh, absolutely. So when you're dealing with an eviction, a majority of them are going to be for non-payment of rent. Now, by design, the eviction is supposed to be this speedy remedy for landlords to use to regain possession of their property. So by law, it's already happening fairly quickly. From the time that an eviction is filed to actual showing up in court, we're talking about maybe a 2 to 3 week window. It's going to happen likely within that same month that the eviction is filed. I lost my train of thought. What was the second half of your question?
Yeah, what are some of those other things that are happening in the court that
Oh, yeah. I got you. So when we're talking about the landlord's protections and versus the tenant's protections, the law is absolutely written in a manner that is in favor of the landlords. Like, for instance, with non-payment of rent, there is no legal defense to non-payment of rent besides to pay the rent. So when you're going to court and the tenant's trying to tell all these compelling reasons, like I lost my job, I had COVID, didn't have a babysitter, had a family member that died, I was really sick and hospitalized, the judge, it's all falling on deaf ears. They're like, yeah, I'm sorry, that's unfortunate, but as for the possession of the property, you have a right to appeal, but if not, you got to be gone in 6 days. So there's no real tenant protections. And even if you're talking about conduct-based violations, most tenants aren't represented in the eviction process. So they don't understand that when it's time for the hearing, it's time to go and have all your witnesses and exhibits or evidence to support why you should not be evicted. They're literally showing up kind of like deer in the headlights and like pleading to the judge's mercy.
Yeah, I hear that. And so what I'm also hearing you say that even if the landlord is also maybe breaching the lease, say maybe they haven't made repairs, they haven't fixed the things that, and the tenant has taken the action as per the lease, saying they've sent written consent, they've asked for these repairs. So even if the landlord is breaching their own lease, they can still go to eviction court and be ruled in favor to get possession of the property solely because the tenant hasn't paid rent. Is that correct?
It's a little bit more complicated than that, but because with eviction cases, there are no counterclaims, there's no collateral issues. So for instance, if the landlord sues you and says, I want possession of my property back, the tenant doesn't get to come back and say, well, no, I have a counterclaim. I didn't pay the rent because the toilet wasn't working or the AC wasn't working. That's a separate lawsuit that's independent of the eviction. When it comes down to those type of protections with even enforcing kind of like, I have something wrong with my apartment and I don't think it's fair that I should have to pay the full rent. A lot of attorneys that work with landlord-tenant issues would advise tenants not to use that statute for repair and remedy unless they seek legal counsel, because 9 times out of 10, they're going to do it incorrectly and they're going to be left on the hook for non-payment of rent. And so they've made these repairs, they've paid money for it, thinking that they were going to get reimbursed, reduce my rent, whatever remedy is available to them, only to find out that they didn't do it correctly. So now I'm being evicted for non-payment of rent. So I've lost money for the repairs, I don't have money for the rent, and I'm still out, out of luck with my apartment.
Yeah. Tori, do you see this and hear this a lot in the eviction court as you're tracking observations?
So are you specifically tenants talking about landlords not remedying things and that being a defense? Yeah, I do see that quite a bit. And I mean, I'm not a legal professional, but it tends to go in the favor of the landlord, as Stormy said.
Yeah. So I'm going to pivot a little bit here and focus on the pandemic. And so we know that during the pandemic, there were lots of protections that came about. We had the CDC that issued the eviction moratoria that needed to be triggered by the tenant to be able to stay housed. We had a couple of places in Texas that had a grace period. Unfortunately, there wasn't one in Harris County. And then there's been rent relief. So we have seen some protections kind of come online during the pandemic. Can you all talk about some of these protections and maybe some I didn't mention? Tori, do you want to take a stab at this question first?
Yeah, I'd love to add one that I think is kind of an underrated protection, I guess, or benefit. The virtual streaming of the courts has definitely helped improve access. So when tenants don't show up to their cases, it's a default for the landlord. And so being able to log on via Zoom and join the case that way, join the hearing that way, has been really helpful. And yeah, I think that's all I want to add on that one.
Stormy, do you have a couple you'd like to highlight?
The the main protections that I'd like to highlight, we have the Texas Supreme Court emergency orders that have given us more, I guess, protections with dealing with, as Tori mentioned, with the virtual streaming or being able to have these alternate ways to appear at court. In addition, those emergency orders have the right to counsel for tenants. So at one point, I have to look at the citations, but at one point they're actually printing on the citations, hey, if you've been sued, you can call this number and an attorney may be able to assist you. At Earl Carl, we're part of the Eviction Defense Coalition with University of Houston, South Texas, College of Law, and the Houston Volunteer Lawyers, and Lone Star Legal Aid. And we actually work to cover the eviction dockets to make sure that tenants that are there have the ability to speak with a legal professional and get on-the-spot representation. It's a little bit more difficult with these larger dockets, but it's still something that is a protection that is available that we would love to keep long-term.
Yes, definitely. And just to kind of continue that conversation, a recent report by January Advisors found that only 4% of defendants in Harris County have representation in eviction court. How does the outcome change for someone facing eviction when they have a representative, when they have an attorney on their side? Stormy, can you expand on that?
So when you have an advocate that is actually knowledgeable about the law on your side, sometimes it may not change the ultimate outcome, because if you violated the lease and the landlord proved up their case the way they were supposed to, then that's just a fact. But it does help in those situations where landlords don't do what they're supposed to do, and we become kind of like these gatekeepers to say, no, the law says that you have to give a proper notice. Your lease says that you have to do this, and we can make sure that we provide those protections for tenants that way, because if not, they kind of get railroaded because they don't know things to say or how to say it or how to present it. Having a legal representative, you have options for alternative dispute resolutions, mediation, or maybe even settlement agreements, or you can use different mechanisms to try to buy the tenant time. So sometimes it's not always like you're going to win your case because you have an attorney, but it does provide for different definitions of success to prevail. And that just kind of depends on what the tenant is or the client is hoping to achieve with their case.
Yeah, thank you, Stormy. Tori, in your observations, have you seen better outcomes when there's a legal representative with the tenants?
Absolutely. And I think a big part of that is, most tenants, this is their first time in eviction court. And often that's not the case with landlords and the landlord's attorneys. So having someone on the tenant side who is knowledgeable about the process and, as Stormy said, the things that the landlord is supposed to do, they can definitely point to those things. And I think the legal aid has been really good about pointing out those kind of technicalities, I guess. And that's really important because those are there for a reason, right? Like tenants need to get proper notice so they know what's going on and can prepare properly. But it makes a huge difference.
Yeah, thanks, Tori. I think another one of these big protections that we got through this emergency order of the Supreme Court was also court navigation, and other agencies and counties and cities have actually put funding into these navigators and into the legal representatives. As we set up all these strategies and protections, how do we continue to implement them in long term? Tori, do you have any ideas?
Yeah, I mean, having things like legal aid and court navigators persist in the courts beyond the emergency orders would be wonderful, right? More resources for the tenant in that way would be very helpful.
Stormy, what do you think?
With navigating these resources that are available, it's very helpful to kind of have a collaboration with all of these different entities and organizations that can impact the outcome. Like even being in court and being able to say, hey, we have a representative from rental assistance on the line. So we're able to navigate and figure out what's going on with this application, or having legal aid representatives that are monitoring the dockets to say, you know, following trends of courts. But that's the biggest benefit I've seen with, it's just this collaboration that puts everybody kind of in the mix, and you don't have to have that hide the ball to figure out who's who and what's what.
Yeah, yes. And I do think that we have seen that specifically in Texas work, that TDHCA, who is the organization running Texas Rent Relief, has been able to work with the local entities administering that rent relief, that have been able to work with the navigators as well as the judges and the courts. And so the better that all of this can kind of work together, like you're saying, it synergizes the work and it makes it more effective. So yes, I am totally in agreement with you all. I do have a question as far as like evictions in the future. And so one of the things that we know is that once you have an eviction filing on your record, it stays there for a while. And maybe evictions can also be looked at in a negative light. Sometimes they're criminalized just for having an eviction. So could you all talk a little bit about how an eviction affects your future? And maybe talk about an example of that. Stormy, do you want to start?
I'll take a stab first. When you're talking about kind of like the collateral consequences of what comes with an eviction, I like to label it's kind of like the Scarlet A. It's something that a lot of people read when they were in school, and it's one of those things that just follows you. It's like a permanent stink that you can't get rid of. It limits the tenant's ability to find quality housing in the future, because if one landlord sees that the prior landlord had to file a lawsuit to evict you from the property to get their property back, why would I want to put myself in the same situation? So I'm just going to eliminate that issue and move, I'm just going to deny you the application, period. If you look at the amount of private landlords that offer the second time or second chance apartments, they're kind of few and far in between, and they're not always in the best areas. That kind of impacts tenants that have children about which school district they're going to be zoned to, what access to resources they have. If you're in different zip codes, then you're talking about food deserts and what access to, just overall resources that individuals have access to. So evictions create this very huge, barrier when it comes to accessing just necessities for life. And if you can't find a place to live, that you can't even begin to fathom how to deal with other issues, because you can't even have that fundamental, like basic essential need that is for basic survival. Another way I like to look at it with the evictions is like kind of like although it's a civil case, but when you're talking about kind of criminalizing it, it's similar to like the Check the Box initiative that was in Austin. And so it's a similar concept. A felon checks the box that says, hey, I did my time, I'm reformed, I played my debt to society, but I have to disclose that I have a felony, so I check the box. If you check that box and say, hey, I fell behind, I was sick, you don't get an opportunity to explain. You just simply check the box that either you're a felon or either you have a broken lease, either you were evicted. It's matter of fact, it's black and white. There's no line that says, please provide more information. It's either checked or it's not. So that's one of the issues that I see with that kind of criminalizing.
Yeah, and we also have a comment here from Dylan who says, even when a case is dismissed and the eviction is overturned, can't a tenant still be harmed by having an eviction case brought them against them?
Absolutely. Like just from my own personal experience before I was even an attorney, got my first apartment in Houston back in like 2013. Didn't know any better. I got a eviction citation on my door by mistake because they used the wrong apartment, but nonetheless went to the office, thought it was all taken care of. And I'm like, oh, why go to court? Because I talked to the office. And that's what a lot of tenants do. I talked to the property manager and they told me everything was good. So I don't have to go to that hearing. So like, before I was educated or informed, I didn't go to court because I thought it was all situated. Case was dismissed because the landlord didn't go as well. Now they did myself. But every time for a 7-year period that I went to apply for an apartment, I had to take a copy of my dismissal order because it was still showing up. Even though the case was dismissed, even though it was an error, it still popped up that there was this eviction filed against me. And so that happens to a lot of tenants of they're getting denied even though they won their case.
Yes, we hear that. We do have another question, and Stormy, because I know you have a background in immigration law. Joe asks, could you speak about the impact specifically to immigrants in Harris County? How do evictions affect them?
All right, so when you're dealing with immigrants, it's a very layered issue because there's already a lot of barriers to access to justice. You have potential language barriers that become an issue. You have issues with potentially lower income because you may not be documented. And so that limits the quality or your earning potential if you're working under the table or trying to survive however you can. And then when you're in the legal situation, if someone is undocumented and they're faced with an eviction case or any type of lawsuit, it's very difficult for them to want to seek help because they don't want any interactions with law enforcement. I don't want any interactions with the courts. I just want to stay out the way. I'm doing life, and this is matter of fact. So there's a lot of immigrants that are kind of like that underprotected population or underserved because it's difficult to get them to go to court as well and not recognize that their immigration status does not have an impact on their ability to get representation or have their voice heard or defend themselves.
Yes, and there are some legal aids that do assist undocumented citizens. So definitely there is available assistance out there. Tori, from your expertise, what are your thoughts that need to be done to improve eviction court process in Harris County? What are these targeted interventions that are needed, or what can a justice of the peace do themselves to improve outcomes for both tenant and landlords?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of options, honestly. Something that could literally happen today would be justices of the peace asking more questions, making sure that they do ask about notice and right now ask about rent relief. And then I would also really like to see more resources get into the tenant's hands prior to the eviction hearing, as well as assistance. And I think the option to have legal aid and community navigators in the courtroom is a great step. But I think a lot could be done if they were brought in earlier in the process as well.
Yeah, thanks, Tori. What about you, Stormy? What can we do to improve these processes? What are some targeted interventions, or what can the JP do themselves?
As for the JP themselves, as the justice of the peace, they have this kind of responsibility to develop the case because most litigants aren't going to be represented. So they're not going to have those attorneys that do that for them and figure out what the legal issues are, what potential defenses there are. So as a justice of the peace, we can hold them to the fire, and that we want to hold these landlords more accountable in meeting their burden for filing an eviction or whatever their burden is. If you have to give a notice, ensuring that it was, posted or delivered in the proper method. If you're dealing with the rental assistance like Tori spoke about, like actually asking the tenant questions. Do you have a pending application? Great, we have a community organizer here. We can verify, we can look up the status, and we can make it more collaborative. Another thing that the JP themselves can do is look at potentially more or encourage more alternative dispute resolution. There's a few of the judges that are very good about, hey, I think, I don't want to put a judgment. You know what? I think y'all can work it out. Put the parties in a breakout room or give them an opportunity to really talk and come to an agreement that doesn't have to be a judgment where the court has to intervene. So I think encouraging some of those settlements is very helpful. Holding the landlords accountable is something that's helpful. And as for just the overall, the right to counsel is something that we're fighting for it to stay because of all of the longstanding impacts that come from something that seems as trivial as an eviction. To some, it's, oh, you have to leave, but it affects your credit. There's jobs that you can't get if you have certain remarks on your credit. There's certain places you can't live. So that right to counsel is something that is imperative.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Tori and Stormy. To close us out today in this panel, Stormy, can you just tell us a quick synopsis of what happened this morning in your court docket to just kind of show what is happening in real time today?
So as background, this client came as a referral from somebody in our office that met him at church. She's a little bit older, not the most technologically savvy, very anxious, provides a lot of information that you didn't ask for. So she's already kind of difficult to manage in and of herself. Finally get the stuff that we need for the eviction case. Everything's good to go. I show up for the docket. It was at 9 a.m. The clerk immediately is like, hey, please hold. I have 200 names to call out. Now, my goodness, you're going to be here all day for this. That it was 200 names just to call roll for the docket. So probably somewhere between 100 people on the docket. As I kind of mentioned before, my client isn't the most technologically savvy. So something happened with her phone or Zoom or internet. I don't know what happened, but she was there. The judge heard her. She dropped off and he decided to enter a default judgment because she wasn't there and he had a lot of cases to get through. So it's those situations where it's really painful as an advocate because you're doing all that you can. You have these defenses that you're willing and able to, but you have so many barriers and so many layers to advocating effectively for your client to make sure that they, at the very least, stay housed so that they can create like a plan of action moving forward.
Thank you. Thank you, Stormy. Thank you, Tori, for your expertise and all your information in this. And we will see you at the end of our panel discussion.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Wow, that was so wonderful. How do you think that went, Jordan?
It was great. I learned a lot from Stormy and Tori, and yeah, I think it will make a good transition into our panel with David and Jay because they talked about so many of the different policies as well as just the trauma that comes with an eviction and the long-term impacts on an individual or a family or a whole community. It can just really spread. So yeah, and I appreciate Stormy sharing about what's happened because I talked about that before we went live. Like it's just we're sitting here talking about this, but it's also physically people are losing their housing like as we literally speak in our county. So
yes. Well, I'm excited for the next panel to hear what they have to say.
Yes, same. So we can bring on David and Jay. Hello.
Hey, how you doing?
Good.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for y'all being here. And we have two policy experts right now, so it's a treat. And but with different backgrounds and different goals and missions of your organization. So I'm excited to hear like similar questions and then your all's different takes on them. So essentially, what we were saying at the beginning, we want to have this conversation about some of the positives, right? Like eviction is something that's so harmful and negative, but there have been these positive and helpful COVID era or emergency time policies that have been enacted. So we want to talk about them, and then how do we go about implementing and advocating for those protections in the long term. But just want to ask you both to kind of take us the general sense first of how do federal and state policies impact local housing and impact us in the local level?
You want to go first, Jay, or you want me to take this one?
Go ahead and go first.
Okay, cool. So, federal and state policies have a lot to do and have a lot to do with local tenants and your landlord-tenant laws. And so one is that at a top level, at the state level, you have certain property laws, tenant-landlord laws that are set by the state. And there's also certain discrimination laws that are set by the state in terms of like source of income discrimination. And then also there's federal laws that also protect you and also add to policy as well on both a local level as well. So I think state and local policies have a lot to do with local landlord and tenant issues.
Yeah. And I think to follow that up, a lot of times when we start talking about the legal side of this, we can get lost in the actual statutes and the way that things are carried out, and not kind of have the big picture that, the way that I've thought about housing law and about how our legal system is set up is pretty similar to, when you look at our transportation networks and how they're set up. The first time that you see a picture of Houston from the 1940s and a picture of Houston from the 1960s, it's pretty shocking because you see that we once had this really dense, livable, walkable community that was just destroyed by the highway systems. Entire communities were destroyed. So like the way that we live right now was all intentional. The car-driven world that we live in is all intentional. It's the same thing with housing law. The systems that we have that prioritize property over people, that will evict someone, almost automatically without a consideration of their circumstances, because technically, the person who they're paying rent to does have the legal priority. Those are all intentional, and the suffering that's inflicted through the law is all intentional. And I think that it's important to kind of center that when we're talking about the law, that, these are not just accidental outcomes. These are all intentional outcomes that were written into the statutes, and that, millions of our neighbors are suffering as a result.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And it makes us think that policies are written by people, right? And whoever is in power, and the intentionality behind policies that have racist implications and harm low income people disproportionately. You're talking about transportation, which is so linked to housing, and housing is infrastructure. So yeah, I think those both made really important points. I want to give a little background behind this question, but we know that housing affordability and just the lack of options was in dire crisis before the pandemic. And multiple studies throughout the pandemic found evictions associated with increased infections and death from COVID-19. So during the pandemic, evictions were literally life or death. They overwhelmed our hospital systems, and they impact the wellness of entire communities. So evictions are on the rise again. I just saw Peter Hepburn from Eviction Lab just tweeted like 30 minutes ago talking about there have been more cases filed in Austin, Fort Worth, and Houston this past week than in any previous week of the pandemic, that we're hitting historic averages right now. Despite that, there are still less evictions happening than before COVID. So this is kind of something we talked to Tori and Stormy about, or Julia did. But what is the number one COVID era eviction policy that you all think that we need to advocate for in order to continue to keep people stably housed?
Well, I think to take that,
you can do more than one.
At the very beginning of the pandemic, the Texas Supreme Court first implemented a pause on evictions that lasted through the end of May. And on top of that, they also gave individual judges an enormous amount of discretion, which is a big reason why, especially in Austin and Travis County, they were able to keep their eviction rates incredibly low, because not only did they have that, were they empowered by the Supreme Court early on, but then the judges in Travis County were really thoughtful in how they can use their discretion to prevent evictions. This is something that we were really focused on early on, was reaching out to individual JPs. We had 70 lawyers from across the state sign on to a letter, basically laying out our argument, which was that justices of the peace have incredible discretion in how they run their dockets, how they look at each case. And they could do a lot to prevent bad outcomes. Like you said, this is a public health crisis. The eviction crisis is a public health crisis. Unfortunately, that happened in Travis County, didn't happen in Harris County. We didn't see that intervention. And I think that's a piece of the larger intervention that came out of the pandemic that I would like to see, is justices of the peace on a larger basis using their full discretion. Judges in Texas just have an incredible amount of power that they don't use by and large. And that's going to continue even after the pandemic, that they'll have the ability on an individual basis. I would say that the extension of that would be, I would hope that the state of Texas would take steps to rewrite our laws. I'm not optimistic that's going to happen, but that's the next step to balance the dynamic where tenants actually can make a case. They do have legal protections that don't exist right now, beyond just the basic question, facts of the case, and whether or not their landlord has the right to take back the property.
Yeah, that connected back to our first question about how the bigger policies at our state or federal level impact. Thank you, Jay. David, same question to you. And I know that you're working on Tenant Bill of Rights and some other grassroots work around that. So if you want to talk about that with this as well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so one of the there's two main ones. One is this kind of right to counsel that wasn't really developed during the pandemic, but I think has shown can very much have an impact on lowering eviction. So making sure that even if you're in a smaller county, that there's somewhere written that you have a right to counsel during these eviction proceedings really will have an impact. It's for the tenant side of things on making sure that, right, the JPs, like Jay said, we're kind of holding the JPs accountable, making sure that there's an attorney there that kind of lets the JP know the process can be slowed down and hopefully will help slow down evictions. The other kind of big thing is what we've seen and what I'm kind of working on with the Tenant Bill of Rights is what we call the opportunity to cure. And what that is right now for the pandemic's process is, again, the Supreme Court order said that JPs have to ask certain questions and landlords have to accept certain payments when it comes to TRR and Texas rent relief. We, in our Tenant Bill of Rights that we're trying to push right now in San Antonio, have something that's written in there that's similar, that would give tenants an opportunity to cure before they get that notice to vacate that Stormy was talking about. So before they even start that eviction proceeding, they're going to be able to get a notice that they are, have past due rent, and that they have the opportunity to cure that rent with payment or with some type of, hopefully, eviction renters protection or assistance. And then if I can get one more, just a third thing that I would love to see is permanent rental assistance. Right now, the state of Texas right now is sitting on $3 billion of ARPA funding that can immediately go to emergency rental assistance that can kind of help out the state. And we've seen, like you said, that evictions are a public health crisis, and they've been much lower during the pandemic. And so if we can have some type of permanent eviction rental assistance, that would be great. And it would be great if we could start with this $3 billion that is just sitting right now in the state of Texas in the bank right now while people are being evicted.
Yeah, Jordan, if I can just real quick add on to that. One thing that Harris County did that was really smart is they put some of their CARES Act money into legal aid. And as a result of, partially because of the work that was done to build a coalition of legal aid organizations in our region, we actually had 1 week of right to counsel in Harris County last fall. I think it was like the second week of November. And, that was the work of, incredible organizers from, Houston Volunteer Lawyers and Lone Star Legal Aid and South Texas College of Law. They were able to put that together for 1 week. So we know that it's possible here. Harris County put in $1 million into that. There's estimates between 7 and 12 million that would take for an annual right to counsel. And with Harris County having $915 million in ARPA funding, I think that's a realistic goal. And the second thing I think is that cities, a big problem that we have is that counties don't have ordinance making power, but cities do. And so that's why the right to cure or opportunity to cure ordinances are so important, because cities can actually govern contractual agreements through ordinance making. We advocated for that at the City of Houston, and that's something that can be brought through after the pandemic to increase the rights of tenants.
Yeah, I think also the numbers that y'all are throwing out there are definitely are within the realm of possibilities, right? I know that there are certain things that, like you're mentioning, Jay, that Harris County did because they smartly utilized CARES money, but there is funding for some of these. We want to get away from calling them COVID era, right? They're not. They shouldn't be. But the reality is, yes, they are COVID era protections put in place. But I want to go back to what David started talking about with some sort of more universal rental assistance program, and talking a little bit about housing vouchers and specifically, like in y'all's work, what would it mean to expand rental assistance and to expand voucher programs to everybody who is eligible? What type of difference do you think it would make for low-income people and families, and impact on the eviction crisis overall?
David, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I can take. So
you started talking about it.
Yeah. I think. So again, I think one thing that we have seen throughout this pandemic is what rental assistance and what some type of permanent rental assistance could do, and what it could look like. And we know that now all 50 states and large municipalities have troubleshooted this process and know how to get money to individuals who need it the most. And so we would love to have some type of universal rental assistance, especially here in the state of Texas, where affordability is getting out of control especially in a lot of our large metropolises in Austin and Houston and other places within the Gulf Coast as well, have seen incredibly stark rises in rents and in homeowners prices. And so having something like universal rental assistance, where people know that they may be able to have some type of assistance and not be threatened with eviction if they lose their job, or something financially, have they go through some type of financial hardship, I think would be great to help ease evictions throughout the state of Texas in the coming future. And then also just giving, talking about vouchers, something that, we're going to push at a state level again is source of income discrimination. Right now, a city cannot put that, and cannot adopt a source of income discrimination. You're talking about the ordinance making process, so they are prohibited for doing that. And so what that means is that a normal low income tenant that does have that voucher can't go into a regular apartment and say, hey, I can pay, whatever rent is. They can discriminate on that person because they're coming with a voucher, right? Because of their source of where their income is coming from. And so trying to get rid of that, we've seen in other states that can have a profound impact of improving the lives of low income tenants, and also making sure that we're not segregating people in places of poverty. And so I think that is also can be impactful from the housing laws that we can learn from that.
Thank you. Yeah, you brought up a lot.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Jay.
And I wanted to clarify one thing I said earlier about the right to counsel. The Eviction Prevention Coalition, 6 organizations, they're still representing clients in most courts in Harris County. There's 1 week where I think they had full coverage, but there's still incredible coverage, and it's because of the really Herculean efforts by individual attorneys like Stormy. And so I think like one thing about this too is like the amount of money that's required to meet the need when it comes to assistance it requires federal intervention, or kind of a fundamental restructuring of how the state of Texas collects revenue, which I don't think is going to happen. And Build Back Better Act, which it still was passed in the House but is still languishing in the Senate. That includes almost 1 million new vouchers. And I think that's the direction that things are moving towards, because you do need to have more assistance. There's always going to be people in that that need that assistance, but we needed a massive expansion of the program, and so we need to pass the Build Back Better Act. There's a lot of good things that it'll do, but that's one really important piece, that it'll massively increase the federal voucher program.
Yes, contact your representatives. Tell them to stop delaying on that, because the goal was to have it passed before the end of 2021, right? And we're creeping further into 2022, and we can't have housing get sectioned off into a smaller bill, because it's very unlikely to pass if it's chunked off. Okay, so last question for y'all. I want to give our audience a little bit of background on this one. Speaking of federal stuff, the National Low-Income Housing Coalition releases data annually that documents these significant gaps between renters' wages, what people are being paid, and the cost of decent rental housing across the U.S. And there is not a single state, county, or metro area in the country where a full-time minimum wage worker can afford a 2-bedroom rental at fair market rent. And here in Texas, somebody needs to make $21.98, so basically $22 an hour, or work 121 hours per week at the minimum wage to afford a 2-bedroom rental home. Unsurprisingly, there are racial disparities within that. Households of color are more likely to be housing cost burdened, i.e. they're spending more than 30% of their income on housing, and more likely to take on further commutes to their job and have to choose between paying the rent and paying for food, utility bills, medical bills, etc. So it's kind of a big question, but just generally, like, what can we do about this? And if y'all can speak to not only the rising cost of housing, but also like the stagnation of wages and how that impacts eviction.
So the answer for me is pretty simple. Unionize. Encourage as many people to organize their workplace, take back power, and demand better. Union workers make on average about 30% more than non-unionized workers. And this is why we're so active in this work. And we're a federation of 92 unions. And we believe fundamentally that, the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, which is still also languishing in the Senate, that would make it a lot easier for workers to form unions. That's also a housing issue, because if workers are not making enough money to pay for a roof over their heads, then they're not able to work effectively. They're not able to do anything in their lives effectively. Just like raising the minimum wage is a housing issue. Right now, we're still in Texas at $7.25 an hour. Raising the minimum wage in Texas would impact about 400,000 workers. President Biden recently raised the minimum wage for contractors to $15 an hour. Federal contractors $15 an hour, and that was an immediate raise for 15,000 Texans. Those are the kind of things that we have to do if we're going to ensure that people can afford their housing. We have to raise wages, and fundamentally, so much of what we're talking about is about power dynamics. When you walk into a courthouse, you are disadvantaged as a tenant in almost every way. When you are in your workplace in Texas and a lot of other states, you are fundamentally disadvantaged. And the way to change that is to pool your power. You know, if you and other tenants come together, if you and other workers come together, then you can right those imbalances. And you know, the policy solutions are really around making that easier. Right now, there's a lot of steps that have been taken by the federal government under President Biden to make it easier to organize. We have a National Labor Relations Board that is proactively finding ways to make it easier. Secretary of Labor that is actually walking picket lines. First union member as a Secretary of Labor since the 1950s. So things are getting better, but we need legislation. And one of the the important things about the Build Back Better Act is that it does include fines for labor law violations, which currently it's very strange, but in the United States, if you violate labor laws, you cannot be fined as an employer. This would change if the Build Back Better Act passes, up to $50,000 per violation, which could have a real impact. Because when you're looking at the way that Starbucks and Amazon and a lot of other big corporations, Tesla, are busting unions, we're talking about sometimes hundreds of labor law violations. And each of those could potentially be fined. Right now, the best workers can hope for is a recouping of past wages. So I think that's the fundamental thing. You know, if we want things to get better, it's really up to us to come together and demand that they get better. And that's how we keep roofs above our families' heads.
Thank you, Joe. David.
Yeah, and I'll focus more on the state advocacy where we've kind of focused on, and I'm going to kind of bring up what I brought up again, is that the state, you know, has $3 billion of ARPA funding, and you talked about, you know, what can we do to kind of help with the affordability issue. One of the ideas that we brought forward, and a housing coalition group brought forward, was, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars for closing cost grants and down payment grants to help people get down payment grants and closing cost grants so they can buy that first home. We will want to put significant chunks of that money into eviction protection and eviction rental assistance, so that we can have some type of permanent trust fund of funds for eviction protection and rental assistance. And also, you know, one other thing, dealing with, you know, homelessness and other issues, have money to build up our permanent supportive housing stock as well. That is very, very lacking here in the state, especially in areas in the Gulf Coast region. And so, you know, we have, you know, limited funds, but there are funds available for this to help average Texans kind of pursue the American dream, and also you know, be protected from evictions. So we do have the resources, and we want to get the word out there that there are resources that the governor and legislature are just sitting on right now, waiting to use as a property tax. So yeah.
Yeah, and just real quick on that, if I could follow up, the other thing about building affordable housing is that, you know, there's an opportunity for a multiplier effect if you're hiring people at a good wage and, you know, with benefits, with pensions. When you hire, you know, a union contractor, you're guaranteeing that you're getting people that are being paid fairly. Whereas right now, in most places, we still have a race to the bottom, where instead of kind of, you know, advantaging our community through this process of building new housing, you know, we're hiring people for, you know, $12, $13 an hour. And that's another thing that we have to get away from. We have to think about how can we combine all of these efforts to ensure that we're making sure that people are getting access to good jobs, affordable housing, that we're having that multiplier effect across the board.
Yes, they're very interconnected indeed. Well, I want to thank you both. I just learned a lot personally, and I'm sure that our audience tuning in agrees. I would love to bring back the rest of our panel of experts. And there's Tori, there's Stormy, hello, there's Julia. And we just had one last question, just another bigger picture question, if each of you can stay, how you see housing as a justice issue. This is something that you all already, you know, talked about today, but just to kind of close us out.
Let's go around the block. Let's start with Tori.
Yeah, great question. I think for me, kind of the historic and systemic discrimination in housing access and tenant rights, right, definitely make this a justice issue. As we've discussed today, there are structures set up to make it harder for families to find and secure stable housing, and that shouldn't be the case. That's unjust.
David.
For me, housing justice kind of means tenant power, and I'm hoping that through grass-led movements that tenants start to gain more attractions and gain more power and get on a level playing field with landlords. Right now, landlords have way more power, and there are way more renters than there are landlords, and so we need to make sure that renters have power, have political power. And have power to kind of stand up for themselves, and so that is something. When you think about housing justice, I definitely think about tenant power and tenant rights.
Okay.
So a century ago, we had people across the country, including some of my relatives in West Virginia and Kentucky, who were paid in company script and lived in company towns. And when they stood up for themselves, they got kicked out of their houses because the company owned their house. And that provoked, a massive uprising, things like the Battle of Blair Mountain, and a huge wave of worker power. And I think that that's what this is all about. This is one fight, fight for equity and for fair housing is also the fight for dignity in the workplace. It's the fight for racial justice, for women's rights. It's all one fight, and it's all about the problems that some people have all the power and some people don't have any, and we all have to take that back.
Stormy.
All right. So for me, tough act to follow with all the good answers that were taken.
Wow.
No, but with housing as a social issue, so we have social justice is like this assertion or like an ideal. I'll put ideal in quotes because it's something we hope to achieve. That all people have the same rights and the same opportunities and access to quality shelter. Like that's a basic necessity for life. So it's like if you can't be safe in your home, like how do we even tackle some of these bigger issues? Like everything is intertwined. So it's absolutely a social issue that it can't be fought in isolation because there's so many factors that play a role into it.
Yes, definitely. For me, housing as a justice issue, I think is just the ability to access these spaces really and be able to understand what's happening to your house and your predicament and be able to talk to the law and talk to your elected officials just as much as any developer or any landlord or anybody on the power side. So just being able to access and have this opportunity to even push into the advocacy and possibly community organize, like Jay was saying. So that's me. What about you, Jordan?
Yeah, well, I think, I wanted to transition into some calls to action as well, because I think your point around everyone's point around people power and us coming together and advocating I think for our communities that is not one person having power and control over others, which I think was really eloquently said by all of our speakers throughout like the eviction process, all the way to how federal and state policies impact people on the ground. But I also want to say for Center for Civic and Public Policy Improvement, we have a resource. So I just wanted to kind of conclude on a couple of things. We have a resource that's a Harris County eviction resource that we created with the Houston Area Urban League. And I think I can put the link to it in our Facebook Live, and it really has a lot of what we've talked through today, and as well as suggestions for local leaders, and legal resources and options for our neighbors and tenants and residents of our community. I also wanted to remind everybody that it is early voting right now. And so we have today, tomorrow, and Friday. Yes, today, tomorrow, and Friday to go and early vote. And then March 1st is the election day. So, putting our people power into action, encouraging people in our lives and our loved ones to go out and vote is important as well. And Julia, I know you have a plug for the Eviction Solidarity Network as well.
Yeah, so as Texas Housers, we do advocacy and policy. And so one of the things that we've been undertaking is observing the courts in Harris County and also connecting with other organizations throughout the state to observe eviction court as well. So if you'd like more information on how to get involved with our work at Texas Housers in observing courts and getting a little more advocacy towards eviction proceedings in the future, please visit our website, texashousers.org. You can find more information to volunteer, and we will definitely get in touch with you. I'd like to thank all our panelists, Tori, David, Jay, Stormy, for joining us today. Thank you so much. It was such a delight to hear and learn from you all.
Yes, echoing that. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. It's been great.
And we appreciate you all for joining us today. Jordan and I had a good time with this conversation, and we hope to just continue exploring these things. There are lots of resources on both of our websites, so please tune in, find us on social medias, get involved with the policy and advocacy side of things, and we hope to hear from you soon.
And I did just post that doc in the Facebook discussion, and it does have links to get involved with Texas Housers Eviction Solidarity Network. And if you're somebody who's faced an eviction yourself, you can also share your story with them, and there's links for that too. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. And thank you to Kate for helping us on the tech side today.
Yes. Kate Rannikin, our Master's in Public Policy at University of Houston, is an intern with Center for Civic and Public Policy Improvement, and she just ran all of that technology, which went so seamlessly. So we really appreciate you, Kate. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Take us away.